Hey there, and welcome to today's deep dive. It sounds like you're ready to explore something that's been on your mind lately, ketogenic metabolic therapy, or KMT, and how it might be a game changer for people with chronic kidney disease, CKD, like you.
Absolutely. It's exciting to see so much interest in KMT these days, especially as it relates to CKD.
Yeah, we're going to unpack the research you've been looking at. We'll figure out what KMT really is, what the science says about it, and most importantly, what it could mean for your health. And hey, with all the buzz around KMT, I bet we'll even bust a few myths along the way. Ready to dive in?
Let's get into it. There's a lot to unpack, and honestly, it challenges a lot of conventional thinking about nutrition and disease.
You know I love challenging assumptions. So first things first, what exactly is KMT? It's not just another fad diet, right? I see you've got some research papers there that go way back.
You're right. KMT has been studied for over a century. It's definitely not new. But it's much more precise than just a diet. It's actually a medical nutrition therapy. The key here is achieving a state called ketosis.
Ketosis. Now, I know you're going to explain this carefully because it sounds a little like ketoacidosis, which I've heard is dangerous, especially with CKD.
You're right to be cautious, but don't worry, they're totally different. Ketoacidosis is a serious medical condition. Ketosis, though, is a natural metabolic state. Think of it this way. Your body is like a car that can run on two different types of fuel. You've got glucose, which is like your everyday gasoline, and then you've got ketones, which are like, let's say, electricity.
Okay, I like this analogy. So usually our bodies are running on the glucose, right?
That's right. When you eat carbs, your body breaks them down into glucose. But when you drastically reduce those carbs, your insulin levels drop. You know how insulin works, right?
Of course.
And your body says, hey, I need a different energy source. And that's when it turns to stored fat, breaking it down into those ketones to use as fuel.
So KMT is basically about flipping the switch from glucose to ketones. And this is where those potential benefits for CKD come in.
Exactly. Remember how we talked about diabetes being a major cause of CKD? Well, at its core, diabetes is a disease of chronically high blood sugar. And what does KMT do incredibly well? It keeps blood sugar incredibly stable.
It's all starting to click now. You're saying that by switching the body's primary fuel source, we might be able to address the root cause of so much CKD, rather than just managing the symptoms.
That's the exciting part. We're not just talking about slowing down CKD progression here. Studies are showing that KMT can even put type 2 diabetes into remission, something practically unheard of with conventional treatments.
Whoa, remission. Now that's a word I know you don't use lightly, but I have to ask, if KMT has been around for so long and is so good at controlling blood sugar, why is it only recently being explored for CKD? It seems like a no-brainer.
That's a great question. For a long time, the focus on CKD was very much on restricting protein intake. And the possibility of using a higher fat approach like KMT wasn't really considered. Plus, let's be honest, there's a lot of misinformation out there about KMT. People hear high fat and immediately think it's unhealthy, but they're often confusing it with the typical Western diet, which is loaded with unhealthy fats and carbs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, it's funny you mentioned that because I was going to ask about that. In my notes, I see I had written down a big question. Isn't a high-fat diet like the opposite of what's good for you?
It's a common misconception. KMT is about replacing those unhealthy processed fats and excess carbs with healthy fats. This isn't about loading up on fast food. It's about nourishing your body with the right kinds of fuel.
Right. And, now that we're talking about it, another thing that always comes up with KMT is protein. Isn't a ketogenic diet super high in protein? Especially meat. I know from my research that too much protein can be hard on the kidneys.
That's true, which is why a carefully managed KMT approach for CKD is crucial. And to answer your question, while some people choose a higher protein ketogenic approach, it's not a requirement for everyone. In fact, there are plant-based and even vegan versions of KMT that can be just as effective.
Okay, so it's really about that metabolic shift, not forcing everyone into the same dietary box. This is already challenging what I thought I knew. And speaking of challenging assumptions, I have to bring up something else I've been wondering about. Don't we need carbs for energy? What about our brains? I always heard that our brains need glucose to function properly.
Another myth busted. Our brains are incredibly adaptable. While glucose is the brain's preferred fuel source, it's not the only one it can use. When you significantly reduce carbs, your body starts producing ketones. And guess what? Your brain can run quite efficiently on those ketones.
Seriously? Like, my brain can run on the same fuel as my car, in your analogy. That's wild. Does that mean... Wait. Before we go down that rabbit hole, I think it's time to shift gears and talk about some of the research you brought with you. You mentioned some studies about KMT and CKD. What are some of the key things researchers are seeing?
Well, one of the most encouraging findings is that people are sticking with KMT. You know how hard it can be to change your diet long term? But studies are consistently showing that KMT is safe and doable, even for people with CKD.
Okay, that's huge. Because even the best diet in the world won't work if you can't stick with it. But besides people actually following it, what are the studies saying about how KMT affects CKD itself?
That's where it gets really interesting. We're seeing improvements that go way beyond weight loss, which is often the initial focus with KMT. We're talking about better blood pressure control, healthier cholesterol levels. And you mentioned earlier being concerned about protein intake with CKD, which is a common concern from what I understand.
Definitely a lot of the CKD diets out there focus on limiting protein.
It's interesting because a lot of the research on KMT and CKD is actually challenging that. Thinking there was this one study, a 2-year study that compared a well-formulated ketogenic diet to both a Mediterranean diet and a standard low-fat diet in people with CKD.
Okay, so they really put it to the test against some heavy hitters in the nutrition world. What did they find?
The ketogenic diet actually came out on top. And this was even with a higher protein intake than the other diets. It really points to the power of ketosis itself, not just restricting things.
Wow, that's impressive. It sounds like we're really starting to understand the nuances of how this works. You know, it reminds me of something else I read about related to KMT, those newer CKD drugs, the SGLT2 inhibitors. I remember seeing something about how they work in a similar way to KMT.
It's true. It's pretty fascinating, actually. You see SGLT2 inhibitors, they basically mimic, in a way, what KMT does naturally.
Oh, really? Can you break that down for me?
Sure. Those SGLT2 inhibitors, they work by blocking the reabsorption of glucose in your kidneys, so you end up excreting more sugar in your urine. It's like a backdoor for getting rid of excess glucose.
Interesting. So less sugar is hanging around in the bloodstream.
Exactly. And that process, that's the fascinating part. It also leads to slightly elevated ketone levels, just like you'd see with a ketogenic diet.
So it's like taking a medication to partially replicate something your body can do naturally through diet.
Precisely. It really makes you think.
It does. Now, you mentioned that KMT isn't a magic bullet, and I definitely want to make sure we address the potential risks, too, in my research. One thing that popped up was a concern about kidney stones. I know you're big on addressing those up front.
Absolutely. And it's a valid concern when you transition to a ketogenic diet. Your body produces more uric acid, which can increase the risk of certain types of kidney stone.
Okay, so that's the mechanism behind it. What can people do to mitigate that risk?
Well, there are a couple things. First, remember how we talked about different approaches to KMT. Focusing on a plant-based ketogenic diet can be really helpful.
Right, so maybe not loading up on bacon every day.
Exactly. And in addition to that, there are specific strategies that can be incorporated to make the urine more alkaline.
Alkaline, that basically means raising the pH, right?
You got it. And when the urine is more alkaline, it reduces the risk of forming those uric acid stones. There's actually a really interesting program called REN-NEW that incorporates this approach.
REN-NEW, tell me more about that.
So REN-NEW is a 3-month dietitian-directed program that combines a plant-focused ketogenic lifestyle with strategies to reduce other stressors on the kidneys, and they've developed a special supplement called Ketocitra.
Ketocitra, this sounds intriguing.
It is. It contains both exogenous ketones and something called alkaline citrate.
Okay, so 2 new terms for me. They're exogenous ketones, those are like taking a ketone supplement, right?
Right. They can help boost ketone levels quickly, especially when you're first transitioning to a ketogenic diet, which can make the process a bit smoother.
Makes sense. And the alkaline citrate, that's where the kidney stone protection comes in.
Exactly. It helps to alkalize the urine, providing that extra layer of protection. They've really thought of everything with this program.
It's pretty remarkable. Now, before we get too deep into REN-NEW, I do want to circle back to the potential risks of KMT. What else should people be aware of?
Well, another concern that comes up is the potential for KMT to raise LDL cholesterol, bad cholesterol.
I was wondering about that. Isn't that one of the main things we're always told to watch out for with heart health?
You're right, but it's not quite as simple as it seems. There are actually different types of LDL cholesterol, and they don't all behave the same way in the body.
Oh, really? I had no idea.
It's true. There's the small, dense LDL, which is the type that's been linked to heart problems, and then there's large, buoyant LDL, which is considered less risky.
So it's like different models of cars. They both get you from point A to point B, but one might be a lot safer and more reliable than the other.
Exactly. And interestingly enough, some studies suggest that KMT might actually improve the LDL particle size, shifting it towards the larger, less harmful type.
So it's not just about the LDL number itself, but also about the type of LDL.
Precisely. But even with that said, it's still crucial to monitor cholesterol levels closely when following a KMT approach, just like with any dietary change.
Absolutely. Regular monitoring is key. Now, while we're on the topic of potential downside, there's one more thing I have to ask about because I know it can be a major hurdle for people starting KMT, the dreaded keto flu. Is it really as bad as it sounds?
Let me put your mind at ease a bit. The keto flu is basically a collection of flu-like symptoms that some people experience during the initial transition into ketosis.
Like what kinds of symptoms?
Think fatigue, headaches, maybe some muscle cramps. Not exactly fun, but not usually anything serious either.
Okay, so not contagious, thankfully, but still not something you want to experience if you can avoid it. Is there anything people can do to minimize those symptoms?
Absolutely. Staying really well hydrated is key, and supplementing with electrolytes, things like sodium, potassium, and magnesium can work wonders.
That makes sense. Electrolytes are crucial for so many bodily functions. It's like when you're sweating a lot and need to replenish those electrolytes.
Exactly. It's all about supporting your body through the transition. And the good news is that for most people, the keto flu is temporary. It usually only lasts a few days to a week as your body adapts to using ketones as its primary fuel source.
Okay, that's reassuring. Now, one last concern I want to touch on before we move on, and this is something I think is important to address with any kind of restrictive diet, not just KMT. Nutrient deficiencies, if you're cutting out certain food groups, aren't you at risk of missing out on important vitamins and minerals?
That's a really important point, and it's something to be mindful of with any dietary changes you make with KMT. It's especially important to pay attention to things like electrolytes, as we've already discussed.
Right, that's our key.
And in some cases, supplementing with certain nutrients that might be lower in a ketogenic diet can be helpful. One example that comes to mind is carnitine.
Carnitine. Now, why is that one important on KMT?
Well, carnitine plays a vital role in fat metabolism, helping to transport those fatty acids into the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of your cells. And since KMT relies so heavily on fat for fuel,
It's like you're giving your body the tools it needs to really thrive in this new metabolic state.
exactly. It's all about working with your body, not against it.
It's fascinating how important it is to think about what we're putting into our bodies and how that affects our cells' ability to function.
It's truly remarkable, and it speaks to the interconnectedness of our biology. But let's be clear, while these potential risks are important to be aware of, they can be mitigated with proper guidance and monitoring.
That's a crucial point. This isn't about self-experimenting with your health,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to something as important as your kidneys.
Absolutely not. This is where working with a knowledgeable healthcare provider is essential.
They can help you navigate those nuances, monitor your labs, and make sure you're doing this safely and effectively.
Exactly. It's all about personalized care and making sure this is the right approach for you.
Well said. You know, as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to something you said earlier about KMT potentially putting type 2 diabetes into remission. That's a big deal, and it makes me wonder if it can have such a profound impact on a disease like that, what else might it be capable of? We talked about ADPKD, that genetic kidney disease, but are there other areas where researchers are seeing promising results with KMT?
It's a question that really excites scientists and researchers right now. There's growing interest in exploring the potential of KMT for a whole range of conditions, from neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease to certain types of cancer.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like we're just starting to scratch the surface of what might be possible with this approach to nutrition.
It's an exciting time to be in this field, that's for sure. And I think it speaks to a broader shift we're seeing in medicine, a move towards understanding the root causes of disease and exploring how lifestyle interventions, like diet, can play a role in both prevention and treatment.
It's about moving beyond just managing symptoms and looking at the bigger picture of how our bodies work and what they need to thrive.
Precisely. And it empowers individuals to take an active role in their own health.
I love that. It's not about handing over control to someone else, but about becoming an informed advocate for your own well-being.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. And the more you understand about how your body works, the better equipped you are to make choices that support your health goals.
Couldn't agree more. This has been an incredible deep dive, and I know our listeners walking away with a wealth of information and a lot to think about. What would you say is the most important takeaway for our listener as they continue to explore KMT and its potential for CKD?
I'd say the most important thing is to approach this with a sense of curiosity, an open mind, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Do your research, talk to your doctor, and most importantly, listen to your body.
Wise words. It's about being an active participant in your health journey, not just a passive bystander.
Exactly. And remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Small, sustainable changes over time can make a world of difference.
Beautifully said. Expert speaker, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. I always enjoy a good deep dive.
And to our amazing listener, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope you found this deep dive informative and empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and you are capable of making informed decisions about your health. Until next time, stay curious.